Welcome to Meet the Candidate. My name is Renee Boston Hill, and I have the pleasure today of interviewing Ms. JenBanwart, who's running for U.S. Senate. And we'd like to just welcome you today. Jen, how are you doing?
Thank you so much, Ms. Boston Hill. I'm doing very, very well. I want to thank you, I want to thank Ms. Thigpen, and I want to thank everybody at GPAT TV in Pitt County and say hello to everybody in Pitt County. And thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, so I do have a few questions. I know our audience would like to know more about you.
Sure.
What made you run or decide to run for a U.S. Senate seat?
That's a really good question. I spent a lot of my career, actually pretty much since 17 years old, as a public servant, not a politician, and I've always been very purpose-driven. And I have 3 small children, and I left the Department of Defense 2 years ago and felt very, very much like everything that I was seeing, this is not a partisan comment, was taking us in the federal government maybe towards down a path that wasn't the right path. And I care a lot about the future. I care a lot about the youth. Not just my children, but people that are young in my party, people that are young that have political aspirations. I have a lot of concern about balancing our struggles now with the struggles that they will experience in the future. And so I decided that I wanted to run. And in that, I will say that I talk a lot with people about knowing the issues, but not focusing on platforms, because platforms will change. And in addition to knowing the issues, inevitably you have to know that there's going to come a time when somebody that you elect, pardon me, to be a public servant in political office is going to make a decision or do something that you're not going to agree with. It's going to happen. And when that time comes, you have to have built a good framework for trust and a good framework for an enduring relationship with them. And so I tell people to focus a lot on character. And I identified what I believe are the key characteristics of a United States Senator, and those are experience, vision, and grit. First, experience. As I mentioned, I have 25 years of experience studying, researching, reading, writing, executing, and answering to federal policy and federal budget. That is more than any candidate in the United States Senate race with me for North Carolina. I spent 2 years as a legislative staffer when I was in college, and then I spent nearly 20 years as a civilian intelligence analyst and leader for the Department of Defense. I hold 3 advanced degrees in international relations and security. It's my passion. It's what I love. If you want to know the difference that experience can make and how it can serve North Carolinians at the federal level, I encourage you to take a few moments to look at my website and social media. I regularly write blog-style articles and posts on current events and systemic federal issues. A year ago, I was writing about the perils of neglecting foreign policy, early indications of United States inflation, the importance of a broader plan to combat illegal immigration, and the importance of upholding states' rights, which is very important, on issues ranging from education to COVID policies and even marijuana legalization. This information could have been used to proactively influence and change federal legislation and agendas, shift national priorities, and serve up legislation that would benefit North Carolinians and Americans. Experience is also critical in establishing the second characteristic, which is vision. Representatives have to know where they are going, but more importantly, they have to have an ability to translate the issues that are important to North Carolinians and Americans into strategic objectives. Representatives have to have an ability to effectively describe their vision so that they can take people with them. Congress is a team sport, and if everyone is unable to work together, we have several presidents and several courts who are more than happy to utilize executive authority and legal interpretation to bypass Congress altogether. There is a precedent for this now. If you want to know the difference that vision can make you need to look no further than this year's session of Congress. The agenda that was put forth by Republican leaders over a year ago assumed that there would be a Republican president and a majority in Congress. In reality, we have neither. And instead of establishing a new agenda, taking into consideration the constraints of the current political climate, Republicans continued to uphold the same agenda. As domestic decisions were made and the world changed, Republicans showed an inability to demonstrate resilience or agility. As a result, Republicans went on the defensive and constituents lowered their expectations. Regardless of what party is in power or who holds the majority, the function of Congress is to pass sound, well-written, balanced legislation that is good for Americans. When Congress fails to do this, this is a dereliction of duty. When Congress fails to balance and/or pass a budget on time, it's a dereliction of duty. Have representation with vision and an ability to mentor and guide others is absolutely critical to the functioning of Congress. Finally, experience and vision help an individual to demonstrate grit, which may very well be the most important character trait in politics. Grit is a passion and relentless perseverance for long-term and meaningful goals. Without grit, vision, and experience, are never able to be fully realized. Grit is the ability to come back to an arena day in and day out and work with others, achieve outcomes that are good for North Carolinians and Americans. At the federal level, progress is slow and encumbered. Opponents are many and friends are few. One must have an inner strength that transcends the harshest critics, the most frustrating stalemates, the constant dissent, and challenges to momentum. So those are some of the character traits that I've been talking to North Carolinians about over the past year,
Okay.
and thank you for allowing me to share them with you.
Okay, it's my pleasure, but we're going to go and maybe just ask a couple of questions. Could you tell us, in terms of education, we know how, education is a big conversation
ma'am.
all across the board.
Yes, ma'am.
And of course, everybody has their view, but let us know, what do you feel are the big issues for education?
Yes, ma'am. Education is such an important and complex and controversial, I should say, issue in North Carolina and America. There is a constant and growing focus on social agendas creeping into schools, but we need to bring light to common sense fundamentals in the conversation. 2/3 of North Carolinian 8th graders did not read proficiently before the pandemic. Nationally, and also before COVID, 65% of America's 4th graders were not reading at a proficient level. Related to COVID specifically, more than 30% of North Carolina's 3rd grade students failed to meet the state promotion standards at the end of last school year due to their poor reading scores. And only 43% of 3rd graders demonstrated reading proficiency, even after getting a second chance at summer reading camp. These are statistics from the superintendent of schools.
Okay.
Nationally, the teachings of history and geography and the Constitution, foundational to freedom and ideological evolution, have become vague, somewhat watered down and compressed to make room for other educational priorities. We need to get back to basics. The single largest risk, I hear people talking about risks to our freedoms and our system of government. The single largest risk is if our children cannot read. The biggest challenge that we face as Americans competing with other nations and maintaining competitive advantage is math and science.
Right.
How we preserve individual liberty through our knowledge of the Constitution, through knowing the good, bad, and the ugly of America, and understanding world history. In the United States, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, education is supposed to be strictly a state and local matter. And yet, after the Civil War, the federal government instituted that education was a matter of national concern, and the level of authority and reach of the Education Department ebbed and flowed until the 1970s, when President Carter called for a cabinet-level department to coordinate and administer hundreds of federal education programs. Okay. Today, the Department of Education operates 300 federal, social, educational, and training programs, and there is not even a universally accepted and interpreted definition for educational program. Okay. To limit the scope and scale of educational influence that can come at the national level. The other thing I like to talk about is, regardless of what your view is as a parent, parents play a critical role in keeping education balanced, fact-based, and honest. For parents to maintain this role, key decisions about education need to be pushed to a level as close to our students as possible, and then made transparent and accessible by state and local administrators. When programs are rolled out from the federal level, parents lose their role in the partnership of education, and worse, the mechanisms for change feel out of their reach. The end result is a growing frustration and resentment in parents that manifests in local school board meetings across North Carolina and America. Local teachers, staff, and administrators are a critical part of our education system because they hold the unique and important role of blending their specialized knowledge of education and pedagogical methods with specific insights about who our children are and how they learn, find themselves caught in the middle and powerless to act in ways that they think are best. Parents get frustrated because they don't see change. Local teachers, staff, and administrators leave their jobs because they cannot change the federal frameworks and priorities that drive how we educate. And our children are the ones who lose. Federal agencies are not built for the kind of agility, innovation, and dynamicism that is required for good education. We need to streamline the Department of Education, minimize centrally held authority and decision-making in our schools. The federal government spends nearly $79 billion annually on primary and secondary school education programs. Although critics will argue that this only accounts for about 8% of the total funding on public education, we see the crippling effects that federal decisions can have on education playing out again and again. Common Core standards, No Child Left Behind, and using federal funding to assert partisan and socially motivated agendas.
Okay. All right, so when we do know, okay, that one of the things U.S. Senate does is that they vote on bills.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and we do know that there are some bills that have been presented and they've not gone anywhere. Yes, you spoke briefly about how when you're put there to do something and nothing gets done, you had a word for that. What was the word? Dereliction of duties. So let us talk a little bit about law enforcement, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
We do know that there were some bills that were presented and
Yes,
they have not gone anywhere. So what is your stand on the law enforcement reform?
That's an excellent question and a scene setter. I think that while I've been traveling across the state of North Carolina, we have a large immigrant population from places like Venezuela, from places like Poland, from places where they experienced in their own countries changes from acceptable government, forms of government, to totalitarianism, to authoritarianism. Some of these individuals actually are traveling across the state this year talking about the warning signs that they witnessed in their own countries that were concerning to them. And having been a longtime student of political science and international relations, okay, when the federal government starts to control the police, they become a defense force. They're not a police department. I support the police, and over the course of the 25 years that I was in the DC area, I observed that there are good and bad actors in any institution. The most effective way to deal with bad actors is to root them out within the organization. If the organization itself is corrupt, then local politicians tend to know about it and should be doing something.
Okay.
If they're not, you go to your state. If your state fails to act, is the only time that we should be dealing with it federally, if that's happening in several states. As a voter, you can directly impact the problems locally by taking municipal elections seriously. Sheriffs, county commissioners, court races, all of these things are in place for you to have control over the challenges that you face in your communities. And that's really appropriate.
Okay, all righty. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about environmental. Okay, environmental, of course, is very important to the voters and to people in general.
Yes, ma'am.
So tell us, what do you think about, what would you do if you had an opportunity to institute or change some environmental procedures that are going on right now?
Yes, ma'am. So I want to start by saying that several Republicans between the age of 18 and 35 have written to me because they are passionate about green energy. And some of them feel like they have to not say that because they're part of the Republican Party. I am underscoring this because the future of our party, the people most affected by climate change and environmental issues, are saying that this is a priority for them and that they want it to be included in our strategy. I don't know how broad the base is of people that want this, but I can say that it's been quite a few people that have written to me, and it's something that we need to look into more. I personally don't have any issue with climate and renewable energy being longer-term federal goals. I don't support massive federal investment at this time, not because I don't think that it's important, but because there are so many priorities that we are trying to pursue, and there is so much work that we need to be doing on funding so that we can free up funding to make sure that we are able to modernize the objectives that we're pursuing and that they are of interest to Americans. So North states right now are being very progressive on green initiatives, and North Carolina, I'm told by young constituents, is one of those. And that we are investing substantially in the renewable energy industry, and I support these efforts. I think that if we start to see major investments like this across states eventually, and there's a problem where a few states are holding out, then it's appropriate for us to get involved federally. But short of that, the best innovation, the best ideas are going to start locally. And that is why states' rights are so important in the Constitution, and why we're going to keep coming back to that at the federal level. Push it to the states, push the money to the states, lower taxes, let people deal with things on a more local level, because that is how we are best able to function.
Okay. So, JenBanwart, okay, you're running for U.S. Senate.
Yes, ma'am.
And a question I'm sure the audience would like for you to address also is, what are your current challenges with illegal immigration? What do you think about your...
Yes, ma'am. Illegal immigration is unfair to people who are working hard and waiting their turn to come to America, and it shouldn't be tolerated by anyone. We need balanced and enduring and transparent legislation reform in immigration, and it's the most promising way that we're going to discourage illegal immigration. If people can see what they have to do, if the path is clear, if they know when they might have an opportunity to do that, if they're in trouble and they need help and they understand what the process is for that, that is our best chance at people self-enforcing, doing the right thing. Once legislation is agreed upon and in place, we need universal and standard implementation across states and local agencies. We have to be able to count on people to be enforcing the policies that are passed. Executive and legislative have to work together to shore up the border, but there are a lot of things that need to happen in order for that to occur. That would be including plussing up manning for land, sea, and air patrol. That would be providing departments and agencies that are working these hard problems with the best technology, and making sure that there are clear and uniform processes and procedures that map to the immigration policies. I see on television all the time people getting picked up, and the agents that pick them up don't know what they're supposed to do. That doesn't serve anyone's interests. Appropriate departments and agencies should also be looking across available data in order to anticipate when there's going to be a surge at the border, when there's going to be a surge of people, of migrants coming from different places. And then that should allow us to be more proactive in our response. Do planning for what are the instructions for the handling when they arrive? How do we prepare for housing? Are we sending people on return flights? What are the support logistics that are required, and whether there are any exceptions to our policy given the situation that's occurring? And the last thing, and I can't emphasize this enough, is the importance of a coordinated and holistic foreign policy strategy. Leaders cannot look at one country. Leaders cannot look at one situation in isolation. The result is impulsive and inconsistent decision making, and it negatively affects the way that other countries view America. The more we neglect proactive foreign policy methods like diplomacy, the more likely that an international issue shows up on America's doorstep, and it will have negative domestic consequences. We're seeing a lot of that this year.
Okay, so just many Americans, I'm going to read this a little bit. Many Americans are concerned about the effect of the pandemic and the excessive spending on the economy. What are your thoughts on why America is experiencing economic difficulty, and what can we do to reverse it?
So many people were concerned that the pandemic itself would have serious negative effects on our economy, but basic and long-standing economic principles proved true with America's COVID response as it did any other time. Anytime that you inject artificial market forces into the economy, the impacts are going to be far-reaching and long-lasting. When the government mandated businesses to close for a long period of time, that was an artificial market force. When the government issued multiple rounds of poorly and broadly targeted COVID aid, meaning it went to a lot of people who really didn't need it, that affected labor preferences. And when the government created mandates for people to remain in isolation for 2 weeks at a time after COVID exposure, that, along with other supply chain restrictions, affected our ability to maintain a constant supply of goods and services to meet consumer demands. This is not a critique of the decisions that were made. It is an observation and a demonstration of basic economic principles at work and how they can have long-term effects. And what we're seeing now is recovery time. It takes time to bounce back from those decisions. Despite the sage wisdom from many leading economists, some politicians are pushing hard for a economic theory known as modern monetary theory. This is not everyone, but I feel like it's important to discuss because it's coming up frequently this year. The premise behind this theory is that the American government can print and spend as much money as it would like without any sort of negative repercussion. While in theory, MMT appeals to our human sensibilities and the desire for individuals to have security, in practice, it's always proven disastrous through the creation of devastating inflation. More recent examples of the perils of MMT include cases like Brazil, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. Hyperinflation took longer than older examples in these, but they were no less disastrous in scope and scale. And as an example, in Venezuela, inflation reached a rate of 80,000% a year by the end of 2018. That would mean that your morning cup of coffee would cost $2,400. And then basically a lot of people are pointing to Japan right now as another example, and their debt to GDP ratio is huge. They have extremely low interest rates with no negative impact, but if the goal is to experience growth and economic prosperity as we have in America, Japan has demonstrated neither as a result of their practices. As a theory of convenience, printing money allows the politicians of today to look like heroes, but it passes the problems and the impacts of onto the politicians of the future. And as I said, I care very much about balancing the decisions that we're making today with the decisions and the impacts that they're going to have on the future, and the decisions that they will have to make based on what we're trying to do. And you can see that very well just through the example of COVID and what's happened in our society.
Right. Okay. So we have been speaking today with Ms. JenBanwart,
Yes, ma'am.
who's running for U.S. Senate. Is there anything else that you feel that you would just like to express?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So in my closing remarks, I just wanted to talk about and go back to the importance of character in selecting any public servant. And people often ask, how can I know this about a candidate? How can I determine what they're like when I see them on the television or I see them from afar at an event and I don't really have the opportunity to get to know them? I think that you can tell a lot about a candidate by how they run their campaign. If a candidate's telling you that they are going to be fiscally responsible, but they are taking and spending incredible amounts of money on their campaign, it's worth noting. If a candidate is telling you that they will be a fighter for you, but you cannot get them on the phone, or you cannot get a response from an email when they are a candidate, it's worth noting. If your candidate states they're going to provide you with transparency to build trust, but they don't fill out any interest group questionnaires or decline to comment on issues that are important to you, it's worth noting. If a candidate sends a team or a staff to an event that you're at to pass out literature to you, instead of taking time to speak with you personally, it's worth noting. And if your candidate is constantly concerning themselves with what other candidates are doing instead of talking to you about what they are doing, it is worth noting. Candidates generally run their campaigns how they live, and it's how you can expect them to serve. I'm not taking PAC money or grassroots donations because I want North Carolinians to select the best representation and vote for free. As a one-woman campaign, I serve all the functions, from answering the phone and returning emails to social media and scheduling, which scheduling is everything, speech writing, and website maintenance. Even though I'm respectfully declining pre-primary endorsements because I believe that they artificially shape elections, I'm filling out every interest group questionnaire that I receive and posting it on my website and social media because I want North Carolinians to know where I stand. At every event I attend, you can find me in the audience passing out my own cards, talking about my platform, and asking questions about what issues attendees care about. And finally, beyond sharing an official list of candidates in my political race when asked by a voter, you will never hear me comment on another candidate's private life. Regarding platform, because we operate in such an agile environment, I created a tiered system of broad issues that determine via a combination of how far the issues fall outside the state of the scope of the federal government, per Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, how many Americans will benefit from the legislation in an issue area, and whether or not it would be possible to amass enough support for legislation in each area to be successfully passed or implemented, given the current political climate. Items in my third tier are not necessarily less important, but they're more divisive, even within circles of Republicans, and therefore it will take more time and resources and carry a greater risk of failure. My name is JenBanwart. Please make a plan to vote. Include me in your plan by voting for me as your next United States Senator on 17 May.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Okay. Again, we are wishing you all the best out there. And again, this has been Meet the Candidate. And today we had the opportunity to speak with JenBanwart, who's running for the U.S. Senate. My name is Renee Boston Hill.
Thank you so much, Ms. Boston Hill, and thank you again to everybody at GPAT. I really appreciate it.